Good evening. This is a television presentation of the Gay Liberation Network. I'm Bob Schwartz, and to my right is the co-founder of the Gay Liberation Network, Andy Thayer. As you noted in the introduction, tonight we're going to deal with the question, do we really need more cops? Police violence has been in the news of late, as I'm sure all viewers are well aware. The situations in Ferguson and Staten Island, New York have grabbed the headlines as unarmed black men have been shot down by white cops. One of the incidents caught on film, and incredibly a grand jury still failed to indict the cop. So many in violence-plagued neighborhoods say that what they need to deal with the violence is more cops. So we want to address this issue tonight. Politicians say the answer is more cops. Rahm Emanuel says that. His challengers, Karen Lewis, well, she's no longer in the race, but when she was a potential candidate, she said, we need more cops. Bob Fioretti has said the same thing, we need more cops. And Chuy Garcia has said that he's in favor of community policing, and we're not quite sure what that means. We hope it doesn't add up to we need more cops. So, there's an event coming up, a Day of Anger, Millions March, Chicago. It's tomorrow, Saturday, December 13th at 1 p.m. And it's at the intersection of State and Jackson in Chicago's Loop. So I'd like to ask Andy to address this question, do we need more cops?
Well, first I'd like to mention to our viewers we had hoped to have Ms. Joyce Brown, who is the mother of a young man, Charles Brown IV, who was killed by Harvey police, South Suburban Harvey police in April. Unfortunately, Ms. Brown had a family emergency and couldn't be with us tonight, because I personally feel that we need to hear from the most affected communities, and that is obviously our African American and Latino brothers and sisters on the subject. And so we hope to have Ms. Brown on a future show. But one of the things that is said over and over again, as you said, Bob, is that politician after politician says, we need more cops, we need more cops. And the question is this really the way to deal with the violence rate? And as we'll show in a little bit, Chicago doesn't have any great deficit of police officers, certainly compared to other cities around the country. And yet the murder rate here in Chicago, as many people know, is actually pretty high compared to other cities. For example, you have the murder rates as documented by the FBI per 100,000 people. Chicago is number 6 on the list in 2013. And yet New York, for example, which has 3 times the population, has actually fewer murders. And as we've seen, sometimes you can't even take these statistics with a straight face, because as we saw in the recent expose by Chicago Magazine, there's a lot of evidence that the Chicago Police Department has been scrubbing the numbers about how much violent crime there is in this city, failing to count homicides as such, and so forth, so as to give the illusion, at least, that Chicago has got a better situation than it actually does. If you look again at the FBI statistics for how many police officers we've got, though, and this is the FBI stats for 2010, they were basically the same for 2012. Chicago has actually got the 3rd highest per capita police officer to civilian ratio of every city with a population of more than 50,000 here in the United States. The only two cities that are above us are Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, and arguably, because of the way statistics are counted, those cities are not actually number one and number two, because they count all sorts of officers, federal officers and so forth, and obviously have the seat of government in Washington, D.C., and nearby Baltimore has a lot of federal employees as well. So this whole notion that more cops leads to lower crime rate is actually a fallacy, as you can see in this next picture here, showing the fewest number of cops per capita of major cities that have actually got low violent crime compared to Chicago and other cities. And these include some rather large metropolises like Denver and Seattle, for example. So the argument is that actually having more cops does not lead to lower violent crime by civilians, let alone by police officers themselves, which for good reason has got a lot of people very angry these days.
One thing that I'm aware of, and I think many of our viewers are probably aware of it too, is that polls show that white people and people of color have a rather different view of the role of the police in their communities. When I grew up in a small town in Minnesota, the police were seen as officers friendly. Mm-hmm. But I know in the communities of color in Chicago, this is simply not the case. You want to take a call?
Yeah.
Okay. We do have a caller, and so let's take that call at this time.
Yeah. Well, our phone tech is busy for just a second. We'll get that caller on. Just really quickly, though, the role of the police is as you rightly pointed out, is a matter of quite contention. I would argue that the role of the police is to basically hold in place the current inequalities of society, not to redress the balance of inequality. And so if you have lots of inequality in a particular city, you're going to have lots of conflict with the police trying to tamp down any attacks on property of the wealthy and so forth. So why don't we take one of these callers here?
Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
I've been saying for a long time that if they already started this pilot program in terms of having body cams on the police officers, but when they started putting that body cams on the police officers, we'd be actually seeing a lot of times what's going on. And on the other hand, it could be a double sword. When they start coming in your home with those body cams, they can use that as evidence against people as well. And I've said, what depends on where you live in terms of the police. This is a black guy speaking. We got a lot of police officers, not all of them's bad. They have the power, the leverage, and the support to do certain things in the community. And then also, when you look in terms of the jail system or the prison industrial system, we have a county jail system where they have these vendors. Their income is based on the jail population, and they have an agreement with the Cook County Jail where they have to maintain a certain amount of people in jail, a part of their contract.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think the biggest argument, at least anecdotal argument, against body cams being any kind of silver bullet is what happened with Eric Garner in Staten Island, New York. It was filmed. And what happened, of course, was that the filmer was the only one arrested in the incident. And we see this over and over again with police officers not turning on their dash cams and so forth, or going after those citizens who did indeed document the violence committed by the officers.
Yeah, and I think we need to move beyond, with all due respect to the caller. Sure, it's true that there are cops out there who are nice guys or nice women, and there are others who are obviously bad. But I think the fundamental question is, as we were discussing a minute or two ago, what is the fundamental role? What is the social role of the police in the communities of color? Is that role really to protect people, or is it to keep people in line and to protect the property of the wealthy? You know, you see all these cops down on Michigan Avenue, you know, where there's a lot of wealth concentrated in the businesses, and that should give one a clue as to what their role is in our society.
Well, and as I think the caller alluded, there's real civil liberties concerns about if these police officers bust in a house and use their body cameras to gather evidence that they wouldn't otherwise to use against civilians. I think on balance it's probably better that they've got these body cams, but I think there are solutions being proposed, such as body cams, that totally ignore the main problem is that we live in a racist society that is fundamentally unequal, and the role of the police is to maintain that inequality.
Right.
And I think people should be insulted when they hear President Obama get on the tube and basically say that he's going to continue with a wanton militarization of the police forces that we've seen since 9/11. I mean, the so-called reform he alluded to in his speech doesn't do anything really to stop the flow of arms to these police officers, that then just gives them more tools to repress people. I think we have to go to and say, well, what are the real causes of violence, both by police officers as well as violence in general that people are rightfully upset about. I mean, I know there's any number of teachers in this city, for example, who've lost their own students, and people are racking their brains as to say, what can we do about this violence? And that's one of the things that we want to address with tonight's program, because there are a lot of myths about what causes violence and what doesn't. And I'd just like to point out here, this is a showing of the murder rates around the world. And what you will see is that the societies that are the most unequal are the ones that typically have got the highest murder rates. And so you can look at Brazil, which has got far more higher inequality than the United States. The police violence as well as the civilian on civilian violence in Brazil is off the charts. You look at next door Canada, which its history of conquest and other cultural factors really mimics that of the United States. It's actually got a much lower rate of violence than the United States. And this is, again, related to inequality. This map that you see on your screen here lists the so-called Gini coefficients for around the world, with red being the worst, and purple being pretty damn bad, and dark green and lighter green being much better. And so Canada, for example, is much better than the United States in terms of its so-called Gini coefficient, which is a measure of the inequalities in society. And that, I would argue, really is the biggest factor in terms of why we have a violence problem. And you can see that here in our own city, in Chicago, a comparison between 1970 on your left versus 2012, with the dark red and orange figures showing the greatest poverty, and the dark green showing the greatest wealth. And what you've seen is the gray in the middle has shrunk enormously over the past 3 decades, so that you've got a much more unequal Chicago than you did just 3 decades ago. And when you look back at that world map, it also punctures a lot of other myths that are out there about the guns and gun ownership the biggest cause of violence. I am no fan of the NRA. I'm no fan of gun nuts. I don't own one myself. But if you look at societies around the world, Switzerland, which has nearly universal adult male ownership, or I should say possession, they're provided by the government, possession of firearms, has got a violence and murder rate which is very similar to that of the rest of Western Europe, which is very, very low. Switzerland is a more equal society than the United States, and that's the biggest factor in why Switzerland has got a low violence rate, not the fact that almost every adult male is packing. There are other factors such as demographics, the amount of young people, particularly young men in a particular society. There's things that our own mayor has done, which I would argue has accentuated the problem, such as closing down all these schools, closing down all these different public housing projects, forcing people across gang boundaries as a result, cutting summer jobs programs. But the main thing is, until you do something about the inequality in society, not only will the general violence be high, but also the police officer on civilian violence. And so until we start hearing these candidates for mayor saying the first priority is not hiring more cops, but to get a summer jobs program for youth, because we've got record youth unemployment, record youth non-participation in the labor market, and so forth. Until we start hearing those things, and I think we're not talking about real solutions to problems that are filling our daily headlines.
We have another caller, Andy.
Andy, you're almost a genius. When you look in areas
Almost.
where there's a lack, where there's a lack of commerce, where they don't have a restaurant, not talking about a McDonald's, they don't have a gift shop, they don't have a supermarket. In those types of areas, it's just like a formula for things to go wrong. If you look at one community that's here on the south side, a perfect example where they have a lot of commerce going on, and it's very rare you hear about any type of crime, Chinatown, where they even have recreation for their youth, where they even have all different types of employment going on down in Chinatown, and it's right here on the south side of Chicago.
Right.
That's my point I'm trying to make. Because when you don't have certain things in the community, and you don't have that money flowing where you can have where people need goods and services, you're going to, instead of having goods and service, guess what? You're going to have guns and drugs.
That's right. Well,
Thank
you, caller. I mean, you look at next door Mexico, which, I mean, we've heard about the 43 disappeared thanks to so-called law enforcement and the connivance of the government, let alone the many, many thousands. I believe it's something like 26,000 who have disappeared over the past few years in Mexico. It's due to the economic strangulation of working people in that country, and arguably the United States has played a big role in that, not only by exporting all these high-powered guns that make their way into the system, but arguably even more importantly, the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement under President Clinton, which allowed heavily subsidized U.S. agribusiness to flood the market, for example, with American corn, which then wiped out the peasant economies of much of Central America. People then still need to make a living, and so they either go into the drugs trade or they go El Norte or whatever. I mean, it's that kind of economic deprivation that is the root cause of the violence, and the violence of the Mexican state allied with the U.S. state to try and keep a lid on it by these disappearances and so forth.
Well, speaking of state violence, and I see this as related to the inequality that you're talking about, Andy. You know, back in the 60s, Martin Luther King described the U.S. government as the most violent on earth. And then kind of following that up, Malcolm X described the violence, the domestic violence that resulted in the death of John Kennedy, the president, as chickens coming home to roost. Now, what I think is an important factor here, in addition to the inequality that you've talked about, is U.S. state violence across the globe.
That's right.
You know, diminishing the value of lives other than American lives, particularly white American lives, and the message that this sends to police officers and security guards, and the whole milieu of violence in the United States, I think, is a reflection at least in part, of U.S. violence abroad.
Well, and we've seen it documented by the United States itself very recently. I mean, not only do we live in a country where every 28 hours an African American is killed by a police officer or a security guard, mimicking that same statistic. Just last week we found out that for every alleged terrorist that the Obama administration targets with its drone strikes and kills, for every person that it targets, another 28 unknown people, innocent people by definition, are murdered in these drone strikes, and that's the ugly head of the United States trying to control the rest of the world through this push-button drone war. When they're not using their troops, which, by the way, are in over 150 countries around the world. I mean, we live in a violent country dominated by a very, very violent state that, while the police officers' killing of civilians may not be at the same rate as, say, Honduras, which has got the highest murder rate in the world, the United States, in effect, subcontracts its violence. When the Bush administration, for example, was using so-called extraordinary rendition to send so-called terror suspects to the torture chambers of Mubarak's Egypt, or to the torture chambers of Assad's Syria or Gaddafi's Libya, the United States was essentially subcontracting that brutality so it could keep its hands ostensibly clean. And while we're talking about this, we should also talk about the fact that the Israeli government, which is the number one, by far, recipient of U.S. military aid, plays a pivotal role in training of police forces right around the United States, including our own Chicago Police Department, which they've had several joint training missions, and the kind of wanton police brutality that we see here in the United States is carried out against Palestinians in the so-called occupied territories, as well as in so-called Israel proper. Both the United States as well as Israel are so-called colonial settler societies built upon, in the United States case, not just the enslavement of African Americans, but also the extermination and the pushing off of the native inhabitants, the Native Americans, or in the case of Israel, of course, the Palestinians.
Yeah, I recently read a book on the crimes against the Native Americans, and I knew the story was pretty ugly, mm-hmm. but the details in this book were just staggering, mm-hmm. In terms of demonstrating the brutality of the genocide mm-hmm. that was carried out against Native Americans.
Mm-hmm. I believe we've got another caller here. No? Oh,
nope.
We lost him. Well, I think we got to bring this back to brass tacks in this mayoral election, because heretofore what I've heard from even the opposition candidates, frankly, has been very disappointing. And while Rahm's got all the money, he's got all the corporate backing, if the so-called opposition candidates are going to be worthy of that name, they're going to have to really cut a very different profile than Rahm Emanuel. They can't keep up with the same old claptrap of hire more cops. And they're going to have to break even from some of their mentors. I mean, Chewy was mentored by Harold Washington, and what people should remember is that some of John Burge's worst tortures under his police superintendent, Leroy Martin, who ignored the torture stories, as did any number of other police superintendents, they continued regardless of being under a new regime. And so we have to, in the event that Chewy or Fioretti gets elected, we have to keep up the pressure on these guys. We can't just accept, bromides like community policing. Let's all hold hands together and, sing and dance to the promised land. We've got to have real solutions. And in a society and in a city that is swimming in red ink, if you're spending more money on police officers or maintaining the current level of spending, which, as we showed, is far out of proportion to other cities around the country, then you're going to be depriving our schools, you're going to be depriving our after-school programs, you're going to be depriving our jobs programs for youth, you're going to be cutting away from the very things that really can do something about the violence, both by police as well as by civilians.
Garcia, by community policing, could mean that he's in support of civilian review boards in the neighborhoods. Now that's something that I think we could talk about. I mean, the cops need to be brought under the control of the people, particularly in the communities of color. And until that happens, as we've seen, the crimes against people of color, whether it be Ferguson or Staten Island, New York, or right here in Chicago, was it Harvey, where Charles Brown was killed?
Right.
I mean, the incidence of this kind of crime is very high, and one thing, of course, that would help would be to indict and jail some of these killers.
Right. And the only way we ever got rid of John Burge was he was fired by the CPD a week after the Rodney King rebellion in California started. We've got to have an elected police board that's got real powers. We've got to stop signing these contracts with the police unions that basically allow brutal officers to remain on the force. And we've got to have real prosecutions and firings of these brutal cops when evidence is brought against them that would indict any civilian.
That's right.
So I think we're probably going to have to wrap it up here, but it'd be nice if people came out to this very important march tomorrow, the Millions March Chicago. This is something that was called by the Ferguson, Missouri organizations. It's going to be beginning at 1 p.m. tomorrow at the intersection of State and Jackson. And so I certainly hope that everyone makes the time to come out there.
Okay, this is the end of our program. I want to thank Andy for his presentation, thank the caller, and we'll see you next time.